Hello, and welcome back to Revelation On Demand podcast dedicated to bringing you the revelation from the Bible. I'm your host, Justin T. Myers, and today I'm unfortunately alone. And since I am alone, and I wanted to talk to you guys about this first thing anyways, we can talk about why Chris isn't here. Now, Chris has some life situations where it's not always the best for him, so right now he's trying to figure out his living arrangements and how he's going to be getting around in life now. I don't want to go into too much detail since it is his thing. I don't want to share more than I'm supposed to with you guys, but I'd like to take a minute and pray with you guys over him and pray for his safety and pray for that he gets to a place where he can join us once again for this podcast, because he really enjoys this. He gets a lot out of this. He loves sharing the word with people. So if we could just take a minute and pray for him, I'll lead us in prayer in that. Father, thank you for bringing Chris to us and helping us start this podcast. We really appreciate all Chris has done, and we appreciate you bringing him to us in the time, or to me specifically, in the time of need. I needed a co-host to really get this podcast going, and I really appreciate that. We pray over his protection and that he's safe in what he's dealing with, and that he does find a living situation that works better for him, and that you would enable him to be able to get the things he needs to join us again for this podcast, because he does find that very fulfilling. So please watch over him and protect him for us and bring him back to us as soon as possible. In your name we pray. Amen. And then, so just keep praying for him, please. I'm going to pray for him. I haven't heard from him in a few days, but he did contact me last week to update me on what's going on. So I don't think he's gone for good. I think he'll come back some point. He just, for some reason, can't talk to me right now. So last episode, we had some technical difficulties. If you managed to download the podcast the first couple days, and then I completely forgot to fix it and get it set up like soon thereafter. So I'm terribly sorry about that. But my editing software has been updated. So for whatever reason, I have the music bumpers and the audio tracks on different tracks, but I guess when you export with a track selected, it only exports that track. So if you downloaded early, you got a 40-minute video or audio file with only the music bumpers on it, and it's probably very loud, and I'm sorry about that. If stuff like that happens again, I'm going to try my best to get on that quicker and get that, fixed before anyone really can notice, or just pay more attention when I'm taking it out of my editing software and actually take out the entire track, not just the bumpers. So that's my fault. I'm sorry about that, guys. My bad on getting that taken care of correctly. Last episode, we talked about Amos 6, where Amos was really starting to get after Israel and Jerusalem for their kind of complacency and slothfulness, and they're just being okay with the obscene amounts of sin that happen within Jerusalem. And he really didn't like how they would tolerate the sin, and they would act a lot like the other pagan and non-believing empires around Jerusalem, and they would still think that they were God's chosen people, even though they were acting like everyone else. And God's laws are all about making them stand out when it comes to just how the world operates, instead of him necessarily, or instead of them being just like everyone else. And it's something that we're called to today. You know, we want to look different than most people. We don't want to react in ways that the world would react. We want to react in ways that God would react, sort of thing. And that's where we get the idea that we need to be more like Jesus. So, continuing on today, we're going to go over Amos chapter 7 for all those of you who like to read along with this. It's not, the nice thing about Amos is they're pretty small chapters, and especially where I think we're going to be going next. I really think we got 2 more chapters here in Amos, so another month of this, and then I really, really feel like we should go into Isaiah. And some of you probably inwardly groaned at that, and I can understand why, because we could be in the book of Isaiah for 2.5 years, I believe, is the math at the current rate. So I'm gonna put it out to you. We can break up the Isaiah chapters, do a chunk of them at a time. I was thinking, maybe 20 episodes or 22 episodes chunks. We'd go over the first part of Isaiah, and then after 22 weeks of that, we take a break and go to something else, and then come back at some point for the second part of Isaiah. A lot of this podcast is just archiving for people to listen to at any other point, especially at the point where we're talking more about the chapters and less about popular topics. That's why I really pulled back from talking about the news too much. It's because I'd rather this be more evergreen content than necessarily something that's tied to a specific point in time. However, I do think having those timestamps kind of things where, this was relevant to us at the time of the recording, it's important too. Just maybe not spending 15 minutes an episode doing it. So that's why we try to keep that to a minimum. And not to mention, the way I think prayer works is that you can pray for things that have already happened. So you can, since God is not a God bound by time, you can pray for things that have already happened, and you can be grateful for them, or you can, pray that God continues to have them happen. So from God's perspective, I'm sure time is very, very flexible, and he can move through time however he sees fit. Unlike us, who are kind of trapped to this linear progression of time, I'm sure he can move well beyond what time is. So getting out of theoretical stuff, we're going into Amos 7, and this is starting out with a vision report, and then this is a confrontation between Amos, who was, this farmer who became a prophet, and Amaziah, who's one of these high priests in Jerusalem and has the ear of the king, which at this point was Jeroboam II. So we see there's a little bit of conflict between Amos and Amaziah here, and we'll learn a little bit of what it's like to be a Christian even today because of this. So we will start with the reading in Amos chapter 7. This is what the sovereign Lord showed me. He was preparing swarms of locusts after the king's share had been harvested, and just as the late crops were coming up. When they had stripped the land clean, I cried out, "Sovereign Lord, forgive. How can Jacob survive? He is so small." So the Lord relented. "This will not happen," the Lord said. "This is what the sovereign Lord showed me. The sovereign Lord is calling for judgment by fire. It dried up a great deep and devoured the land. Then I cried out, 'Sovereign Lord, I beg you, stop. How can Jacob survive? He is so small.' So the Lord relented. 'This will not happen either,' the sovereign Lord said. This is what he showed me. The Lord was standing by a wall that had been built true to plumb, with a plumb line in his hand, and the Lord asked me, 'What do you see, Amos?' 'A plumb line,' I replied. Then the Lord said, 'Look, I am setting a plumb line among my people Israel. I will spare them no longer. The high places of Isaac will be destroyed, and the sanctuaries of Israel will be ruined. with my sword I will rise against the house of Jeroboam. So right off the bat here, we see Amos in kind of a confrontation with God. And we see this often in the Bible where our heroes of the story are either talking or interacting with God in some way. And very few people, I'm thinking Israel to be exact, actually kind of oppose, or Abram actually is the one that I'm thinking of. Israel. Israel did wrestle with God, but Abraham actually interceded on his nephew's behalf, Lot, in the time of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, where he kind of interceded in the same way. And again, in the same way, God kind of steps down his punishment to a point, in the same way that Abraham, talked him down, like, well, if there's even one righteous man in there, won't you spare the city? And God's like, okay, fine. And then he gets the righteous man out of that city, and then he doesn't spare the city any longer. So in the same way, we see that God's still going to destroy Israel. He's just not going to wipe them out. Like, he's starting off at the beginning. We see him talking about the crops and their seasons. And Israel has two main growing seasons. There's the first, which is planted in the autumn and then harvested in the spring. So this is a crop that was put in the ground before winter would be officially in there. Of course, in Israel, winter's the more wet season, instead of it necessarily being cold and snowy, as some of us know here in the U.S. And the second season was planted in winter and harvested in the early summer. So the hot time was the only time that they didn't grow crops necessarily. It was that dead heat of summer until it started to cool again in the autumn. And anyways, this first crop was a crop that, the king of the area, or Jerusalem in this case, Jeroboam, he would take a majority of that share. And the second crop was mostly for farmers to make a living off of, to feed their families, to help themselves. And so we see that the locusts come and are striking at the second harvest. So this is God's judgment on the people, not just the king. Now, it's going to cause issues for the king, because any king who has starving subjects knows that they become unruly, and then he has issues with, people actually following rules and doing what they're supposed to. So the second crop, the locust is threatening, is attacking the people directly. And this is God's judgment on the people for allowing the things that have happened that we've gone over for the past several weeks. And then the second vision includes a symbol of fire. And anytime you see fire in the Bible, it's usually divine judgment or purification, as we see times where God is represented by like a pillar of fire or a flaming, glowing person. So we often see divine judgment, such as Sodom and Gomorrah, where fire was used to divinely judge people, or purification, as we see when I think it's Isaiah has the vision of all the things he did in his life passing through the fire, and only the most beneficial stuff survives that. And then we see Amos on both occasions, kind of getting in God's way and saying, hey, can we not do this? It's going to completely wipe them out. Like, can they have a little mercy? Like, I know they probably don't deserve it, but that's what mercy is. It's undeserved. So could you maybe not wipe them out? And God's like, okay, fine. But then he's like, okay, they're going to be destroyed this way though. And this way, God this kind of gives us insight in how we're supposed to act today. So for anyone who doesn't know what a plumb line is, it is a construction tool. And today we probably have much more advanced lasers and stuff like that would be much much more useful. But this is a pretty simple tool that anyone can make with a piece of string and a heavy weight. And it doesn't need to be too heavy. I mean, you don't want to break the string, but this pretty much, this weight and string is designed to help you see if any given thing is straight. Because whenever you hang a weight from a string and you hold it, it'll hang straight down. Now it'll move a little bit, but it'll pretty much give you a straight line, so you can hold it up and see if anything looks straight, or if it's leaning, or if it's crooked. So this last vision here is kind of a metaphor for, because when they would look at that, they'd say, is it true? Is it true to the plumb line? And so this is an outside standard, an external standard that God is going to use to judge Israel by. And of course, we know what that standard is. It is the Old Testament. It is the Deuteronomy and Levitical laws that he had given these people already. And that is the plumb line he's going to measure them with. And we see that he's going to say that they're not. So he's going to tear them down and rebuild them. It pretty much is what he's saying there. And even today, we see that our standard of how we should live as Christians is by the examples we see in Jesus in the New Testament. And the Old Testament is very important for us still to read. Don't get me wrong, but Jesus is our example. He is our plumb line. He is the one that we try to act like. He's the one we try to emulate. And I know we can't do that perfectly every time. And I know that, sometimes we have our foibles and our flaws, and those get in the way. And of course, we're not going to be perfect like Jesus was, but we can definitely do better, and we can do more things like Jesus would. It kind of, that's where this whole "what would Jesus do" idea came from. Those little bracelets that a lot of kids had. Oh, that was 15 years ago, 10 years ago, something like that. They had all these WWJD bracelets and whatnot, like reminders to do what Jesus does. And again, he's our plumb line today. That's the point I was getting at. So at the end of this, he says that the house of Jeroboam, which could be the current king Jeroboam II, but it could also mean his predecessor Jeroboam I, who actually set up these high sanctuaries, these high places that were not what God had wanted. They were not the correct temples. There was things in them that weren't correct. They would blend in, other beliefs and stuff like that. And we've talked on several episodes about how often you would find other belief systems in the same temples as the temples of God. And that's what they're getting at. Those kind of, he's saying he's going to tear down those places. And of course, when Assyria comes in, they destroy a lot of these high places because they see worship of God as a blasphemous thing in their culture. So they would destroy a lot of these high places because they're even associated with God. And of course, God's like, you know what? You could destroy those. I don't even care. They're not really directed at me. So thank you. Please wipe those out. Those false sanctuaries and whatnot. Thank you. Like, this is how he uses evil for good. So we'll continue on with Amos 7 at verse 10. Then Amaziah, the priest of Bethel, sent a message to Jeroboam, king of Israel. Amos has raised a conspiracy against the very heart of Israel. The land cannot bear all his words. For this is what Amos is saying. Jeroboam will die by the sword, and Israel will surely go into exile away from their native land. Then Amaziah said to Amos, "Get out, you seer, go back to the land of Judah, earn your bread there, and do your prophesying there. Do not prophesy any more at Bethel, because this is the king's sanctuary and the temple of the kingdom." Amos answered Amaziah, "I was neither a prophet nor a son of a prophet, but I was a shepherd, and I also took care of sycamore fig trees. But the Lord took me from tending the flock and said to me, Go prophesy to my people Israel. Now then, hear the word of the Lord. You say, do not prophesy against Israel, and stop preaching against the decadence of Isaac. Therefore, this is what the Lord says. Your wife will become a prostitute in the city, and your sons and daughters will fall by the sword. Your land will be measured and divided up, and you yourself will die in a pagan country. And Israel will surely go into exile away from their native land. So we see Amos didn't take too kindly to Amaziah challenging him. Amaziah is pretty much accusing Amos of just stirring up trouble. Apparently being a prophet was it's still a thing today, actually, now that I think about it. It was a way to make a living, I guess you could say. And diviners and stuff like that was also a way to make a living back then, and it still is today, unfortunately. So Amaziah is pretty much calling him just, a street preacher that's trying to stir up trouble, that he's known for stirring up trouble, that he does this all the time. So how can we believe everything he says? He's trying to discredit Amos. And of course, Amos is like, dude, I was a farmer before I did this. I had, and we kind of dug into this a little bit at the beginning of Amos. He had a good life. He wasn't just some farmhand. He was a farm owner. Like he owned land, he owned cattle, he owned a lot of stuff. Like he was not in need of money when he became a prophet. So pretty much Amaziah is calling him a prophet for profit, to play on words there. And Amos is like, dude, yeah, you're way off on this one. So Amos refers to how he was a farmer, not a prophet. And then he talks about how his father wasn't a prophet. And he probably said, my father's father wasn't a prophet. And like, there's no way you can call me a prophet for the fact of making a living when this is not something that I have any history of doing or anyone in my family has history of doing. So you're talking out of your butt, Amaziah, pretty much is what he's saying. And then he talks again about the exile of Israel, that they will, go away from their native land. And exile is very much a punishment that we see often in the Bible, where Israel forgets what they're doing. They are not following God correctly. They get in the way of their smells. They like to do things that they're not supposed to and stop following God. And we see that over and over again, they become exiled to their own country, the promised land, that God's like, hey, you be my people, you do good things, this is your land. And so, of course, when they're not doing good things, they're not being God's people like they should be, God's like, okay, exile, you're getting sent to your room, quote unquote, pretty much is what God's doing to them with these. And then Amaziah gets cursed here by Amos. And of course, this is because Amaziah was insulting Amos for just stirring the pot and trying to make money off of it. And Amaziah has avoided calling Amos a prophet. In fact, the word he's saying, even though he might have called him a prophet in English translations, the original text, Amaziah is specifically not using any word that could be associated with prophet. It's actually a word that is associated with seer, which again would be going to that more mystical, reading your future sort of tradition instead of being a prophet of God. Again, trying to dismiss how much he knows or how legitimate he is. So then Amos refutes him and then curses him. And I mean, this is a rough punishment. He says, your wife's going to be a prostitute, which I really don't need to explain. So your sons and daughters will fall by a sword, like they're all going to die, and the land will be divided up. Like you're going to lose all your land and everything. And then you will go die in a pagan country. So pretty much he's saying you're going to be taken as a slave to another country. All your stuff's going to be gone. Your wife's going to be a prostitute and your children will be dead. and then you will die in that foreign country away from our God. And like, this is a pretty rough curse. Even by today's standards, that's a pretty rough curse. If you tell someone, I want you to die in a foreign country, I want your wife to go become a prostitute, and your children to die, that is a curse. I don't know how else to put that. So, and I'm not sure if this happened to Amaziah. I'm not sure if this is prophetic or if this is just Amos, wishfully thinking this upon him, because he was probably a thorn in Amos's side this entire time that he's been a prophet. So this is probably just Amos getting a little angry and, venting, which we all do from time to time. And again, we're not perfect like Jesus was, but he did get angry every now and then. If we want to talk about that too, just because he's perfect doesn't mean he didn't get angry. Now, he would get angry in an unsinful manner, which, unlike us, I'm sure is definitely an interesting kind of anger. We tend to fall into sin too much when we anger. We tend to focus more on, how we're feeling and what we want and what we can get from the situation and what we're not getting from the situation. And that tends to be the wrong kind of anger. Whereas when Jesus was angry, he was angry about how people were treating God. He was angry about how they were blatantly sitting in holy places or in the presence of God, sort of thing. And that was the sort of thing he would get angry about. It wasn't about them being disrespectful to him. Anytime he was disrespected or treated poorly, he would often just, let it go, not respond. Because again, he knew he had the power to respond in a very powerful way. And of course, it'd be like us swatting at a fly, even if we didn't mean to harm it. If he would retaliate in the same manner, it would destroy people. So what's the takeaway for today? We see that Amos here gives us a good example of what it's like to try and follow God, even if we're flawed humans. He still gets angry. He cursed Amaziah here, and maybe that was a little over the top. And maybe he didn't need to, but of course we don't also know how big of a thorn in Amos' side Amaziah was. The fact that it made it into the story at all probably means it was quite, he was quite the thorn. But we see that even though Amos has lost his temper here, and he's still trying to carry out God's will, he's still trying to do what God has called him to do. So we see tenacity in today's reading, I believe, where we continue to do the things that God has called us to do, even when we fail, even when we fall down, even when we mess up, even when we are sinful, even when it's been a bad day. And I've had those. I've had several of those this week. It's just a bad day. Nothing goes right. We're just in a bad mood, and maybe we snap at our wife or kids in a way we shouldn't have. And then we have to apologize for that. And it doesn't feel good. We just had a bad day, and we're still called to continue doing what God wants us to do, and act in a way much like Jesus. He was our example, even if we're not feeling good, even if we had a bad day, and we still give those things up to God every day. I had a bad day last week, and at the end of the day, I was like, you know what? This was a terrible day, God. You've seen it all. I give it up to you. You make something good of it, because I obviously didn't. And it's just one of those things. You have a bad day like that, you got to give it up to God and continue on. And if Chris is listening, I hope that you continue on too, man. We hope to see you back soon. I will continue on with this podcast at our regularly timed schedule, and I promise I will do my best to actually make sure that's edited correctly this time, instead of releasing blank Aether episodes. And I really appreciate everyone who is listening on a regular basis, and thank you guys for allowing us to do this and take up a chunk of your time every day. Really appreciate that. Thank you for listening to the Revelation On Demand podcast. Please like, share, and subscribe wherever you catch your podcast from. Please, if you like what we're doing, share this with a friend, family member, or someone from your church. This is a completely private venture and received no funding from any sources. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns, please feel free to contact me at revelationondemand@gmail.com. God bless, and see you next time.